The grand dining hall at Kensington Palace buzzed with quiet tension as staff members prepared for another royal meal. Head chef Marcus Williams had been working in royal kitchens for over 15 years, but he still felt nervous whenever Prince William requested a private dinner. Not because the prince was difficult, but because of the incredibly strict list of foods that could never, under any circumstances, appear on his plate. No shellfish, no rare meat, no unfamiliar spices, and absolutely no food from unknown sources, Marcus muttered to himself as he reviewed the guidelines for the 100th time. These weren't just preferences written down by a spoiled royal, they were rules that had been passed down through generations, written in blood and learned through tragedy. Prince William sat in his private study, reviewing documents for his upcoming trip to Australia. At 39 years old, he had grown accustomed to people questioning his eating habits. Friends from his university days at St. Andrews often joked about how he would politely refuse certain dishes at restaurants, or how he would sometimes bring his own food to casual gatherings. They thought he was being precious, acting like the privileged prince he was born to be. They had no idea how wrong they were. The truth about William's food restrictions began decades before he was even born, rooted in a history of royal poisonings that the public never learned about. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had quietly instilled these rules in every member of the royal family, but William had taken them more seriously than most. He had reasons that went far deeper than anyone suspected. Catherine, his wife, walked into the study carrying a cup of tea and a small plate of digestive biscuits. Even these simple snacks had been prepared according to strict protocols. The tea came from a sealed container that had been tested, the biscuits were from a trusted supplier that had been providing to the royal household for over 50 years, and even the water used to make the tea had been filtered through multiple systems. "The children are asking why you can't eat pizza like normal dads," Catherine said with a smile, settling into the chair across from her husband. "Charlotte specifically wants to know why you always order yours without the toppings everyone else likes." William looked up from his papers and smiled back. His children George, Charlotte, and Louis were growing up with these same food restrictions, though they didn't understand why yet. How could he explain to a 7-year-old that their great-great-grandfather King George V had narrowly survived a poisoning attempt at a state dinner in 1923? Or that their great-grandmother had witnessed 3 separate incidents where royal family members became mysteriously ill after eating at public events? "Tell Charlotte that Daddy has a sensitive stomach," William said diplomatically. It was the same explanation he had been giving for years, and it wasn't entirely false. The stress of knowing that every meal could potentially be your last did tend to affect one's digestion. But Catherine knew better. She had been briefed on the real reasons during their engagement, when she was being prepared to join the royal family. The conversation had taken place in a secure room at Buckingham Palace, with representatives from the Royal Protection Unit explaining protocols that sounded more like something from a spy novel than a discussion about wedding planning. The restrictions weren't random. Shellfish was avoided because it spoiled quickly and could easily mask the taste of certain poisons. Rare meat was off-limits because undercooked food provided perfect cover for biological agents. Unfamiliar spices were forbidden because they could hide chemical tastes that might alert the victim to danger. And food from unknown sources was simply too risky to even consider. These rules had been developed over centuries of learning from mistakes, close calls, and actual deaths. The royal family's food protocols were written in response to real threats that had claimed real lives, though most of these incidents had been carefully hidden from public knowledge to avoid panic and maintain the monarchy's image of stability. William's personal adherence to these rules had intensified after an incident that occurred during his military service in 2009. While serving with the Royal Air Force, he had attended a dinner at a base in Afghanistan where several officers became violently ill after eating what appeared to be a perfectly normal meal. The official report blamed food poisoning from poor storage conditions, but William had noticed something that troubled him deeply. He had been served the same meal as everyone else, but had followed his ingrained royal protocols and avoided several of the dishes. While 12 officers spent the night in the medical unit, William remained completely healthy. It could have been coincidence, but it could also have been something much more sinister. The incident reinforced lessons that had been taught to him since childhood. His father, Prince Charles, had drilled these food safety rules into William's head from an early age, just as Charles had learned them from his own parents. But Charles had learned these lessons through stories and warnings. William had learned them through experience. During his youth, William had witnessed several concerning incidents that were never reported to the press. At a charity gala when he was 16, he watched a foreign diplomat collapse after dinner, convulsing violently before being rushed to the hospital. The official explanation was a severe allergic reaction, but William noticed that the man had been eating from the same serving dishes as several royal family members. At a state dinner 2 years later, William observed his grandmother quietly signal to security after noticing something suspicious about the wine service. Within minutes, the entire royal party had excuses to leave early, citing scheduling conflicts. The next morning, William learned that one of the servers had been arrested on unrelated charges, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the timing wasn't coincidental. These experiences had taught William that the food restrictions weren't paranoid overreactions, they were necessary precautions in a world where his family remained targets for people with various motivations. Political extremists, foreign agents, mentally unstable individuals, and even rivals within the British establishment all posed potential threats that could be carried out through something as simple as a dinner invitation. The protocols extended far beyond just avoiding certain foods. Every meal William ate was prepared by trusted staff who had undergone extensive background checks. The ingredients came from approved suppliers who were monitored regularly. Even water was tested before being served to any member of the royal family. When William traveled, these precautions became even more elaborate. His security detail included specialists trained in detecting food tampering, and every meal was either prepared by his own staff or carefully vetted by local authorities who had been briefed on royal requirements. Public events where food was involved required detailed advance planning that included testing everything from the serving utensils to the tablecloths. The psychological impact of living with these restrictions was something William had learned to manage, but it wasn't easy. Simple pleasures that other people took for granted, trying a new restaurant, accepting a dinner invitation from friends, or even eating food prepared by well-meaning strangers, were luxuries he couldn't afford. During his university years, William had tried to live more normally, but several incidents had reinforced why the restrictions existed. At a pub in St. Andrews, he had become violently ill after eating what appeared to be a perfectly normal shepherd's pie. While his friends assumed it was just bad food, his security detail had quietly investigated and found evidence that someone had deliberately tampered with his meal. The incident was hushed up to avoid publicity, but it served as a stark reminder that even in seemingly safe environments, William remained a target. The person responsible was never identified publicly, but William learned that they had been asking specific questions about his usual dinner plans in the days leading up to the incident. As William sat in his study, reviewing documents and sipping his carefully prepared tea, he reflected on how these restrictions had shaped his entire relationship with food. Meals weren't opportunities for pleasure or social bonding, they were calculated risks that had to be carefully managed to ensure his survival and the continuation of the royal line. But the restrictions had also taught him valuable lessons about trust, vigilance, and the weight of responsibility that came with his position. Every meal was a reminder that his life wasn't entirely his own, that his survival was connected to larger questions about the stability of the monarchy and the safety of his family. The children would learn these lessons eventually, just as he had. They would understand that their father's sensitive stomach was actually a complex web of security protocols designed to keep them all alive. They would learn that being royal meant accepting certain limitations in exchange for the privilege of their position. For now, though, William was content to let them enjoy their childhood innocence, eating pizza with normal toppings and not worrying about whether someone might want to hurt them simply because of the family they were born into. Those worries would come soon enough, along with the weight of understanding what it truly meant to be next in line for the throne. The food restrictions were just the beginning of a much larger story about sacrifice, duty, and the hidden costs of royal life that the public never saw. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Clarence House as Prince Charles prepared for his weekly meeting with his eldest son. On the polished mahogany table lay a thick folder marked Confidential Royal Protection Unit, containing reports and analysis that would never see the light of day in any newspaper or royal biography. This wasn't a typical father-son breakfast discussion about family matters or royal duties. This was a briefing session about survival. Charles had requested this particular meeting after receiving intelligence reports that concerned him deeply. Recent threats against the royal family had intensified, and several of them specifically mentioned plans involving food service at upcoming public events. The threats weren't from the usual sources of concern, political extremists or mentally unstable individuals making vague warnings. These came from organized groups with sophisticated knowledge of royal security protocols. The Glasgow Food Festival next month, Charles began, sliding a photograph across the table to William. MI5 has identified at least 3 individuals with concerning backgrounds who have applied for vendor positions. 2 of them have connections to groups that have made specific threats against you personally. William studied the photograph carefully. It showed a typical food festival setup with dozens of vendors, thousands of visitors, and what appeared to be a security nightmare. He had been scheduled to make a surprise appearance at the event as part of his ongoing effort to support Scottish businesses, but the intelligence reports were making that increasingly complicated. "What kind of connections?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Over the years, he had learned to read between the lines of these security briefings. When his father mentioned concerning backgrounds, it usually meant people with training in chemistry, biology, or other sciences that could be weaponized against the royal family. Charles opened the folder and pulled out several surveillance photographs. The first individual worked as a laboratory technician before being dismissed for stealing chemical compounds. The second has extensive knowledge of organic chemistry and has been monitored making purchases of materials that could be combined to create undetectable toxins. The third is a former military specialist with expertise in biological warfare agents. The photographs showed ordinary-looking people who could easily blend into any crowd. This was always the most unsettling aspect of these briefings for William. The threats didn't come from obvious villains or cartoonish antagonists. They came from people who looked like neighbors, teachers, or shopkeepers, individuals who could serve him fish and chips with a smile while potentially poisoning him with substances that wouldn't show symptoms for hours or even days. William had first learned about the sophistication of modern assassination techniques during a private briefing when he turned 18. The Royal Protection Unit had explained that the days of crude poisoning attempts using easily detectable substances were long over. Modern threats involved designer toxins that could be engineered to mimic natural causes of death, substances that broke down rapidly to avoid detection in autopsies, and biological agents that could be transmitted through seemingly innocent contact. "There's something else," Charles continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Intelligence suggests these individuals aren't working independently. There's evidence of coordination and planning that indicates a larger operation." This was the nightmare scenario that kept royal security officials awake at night. Individual threats could be managed through careful screening and monitoring, but organized groups with multiple operatives required much more extensive countermeasures. It meant that William's food restrictions, already comprehensive, would need to become even more stringent. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Catherine entered, carrying their youngest son Louis, who was babbling happily and reaching for everything within his grasp. She paused when she noticed the serious expressions on both men's faces and the classified documents spread across the table. "Should I come back later?" she asked diplomatically. Catherine had learned to recognize when royal family discussions involved security matters that required privacy. "Actually, you should hear this," William said, gesturing for her to sit down. "These restrictions are going to affect all of us for the next several months." Charles quickly briefed Catherine on the intelligence reports and their implications for upcoming royal engagements. As the future queen, she needed to understand not just the immediate threats but the broader context of why the royal family's relationship with food had become so complicated over the generations. The history began long before any of them were born, rooted in centuries of royal assassinations that had shaped monarchy security protocols across Europe. Charles explained how the royal family's food restrictions had evolved from basic precautions into sophisticated countermeasures based on actual attacks and near misses that had claimed lives and changed the course of history. "My grandfather King George VI survived at least 2 confirmed poisoning attempts," Charles revealed, sharing information that had never been made public. The first occurred in 1943 during a private dinner with Allied commanders. 3 other individuals at the table died within hours, officially from food poisoning, but intelligence reports suggested Nazi agents had infiltrated the kitchen staff. Catherine listened with growing concern as Charles described incident after incident that had been carefully hidden from public knowledge. Royal family members who had died from mysterious illnesses that were later suspected to be assassination attempts. Foreign dignitaries who had collapsed after sharing meals with British royalty. Kitchen staff who had been discovered with suspicious connections and quietly dismissed without explanation. "The second attempt against my father was even more sophisticated," Charles continued. "Someone had developed a toxin that mimicked the symptoms of his existing health conditions. If not for random chance, a server accidentally mixed up 2 plates, he would have died from what appeared to be natural causes related to his smoking habit." William had heard some of these stories before, but listening to them again while holding his son reinforced the weight of responsibility he carried. Louis would grow up with the same restrictions, the same careful protocols, and the same understanding that every meal carried potential risks that ordinary families never had to consider. The protocols had been refined over decades of learning from close calls and actual attacks. The royal family's food service operations now resembled military or intelligence agency procedures more than typical household management. Background checks for kitchen staff were more thorough than those required for government security clearances. Food suppliers were monitored continuously, with some contracts requiring suppliers to submit to surprise inspections and testing. Even the logistics of royal meals required careful coordination. When William traveled internationally, advance teams would arrive weeks early to establish secure supply chains for food and water. Local authorities would be briefed on protocols without being told the specific reasons, creating layers of security that protected the royal family while maintaining diplomatic relationships. "The children don't understand yet," Catherine said, bouncing Louis gently as he played with her necklace. "George asks why he can't eat birthday cake at his friends' parties like other children. How do we explain that someone might want to hurt him simply because of who his father is?" This was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of royal life that the public never saw. William and Catherine's children couldn't enjoy the simple pleasures of childhood that their parents had tried to provide. Playdates required security screenings. Birthday parties needed advance planning and vetted food suppliers. Even school lunches had to be carefully managed to ensure their safety. William remembered his own childhood confusion about these restrictions. He had been 8 years old when his mother Diana had quietly explained why he couldn't accept homemade cookies from well-meaning visitors to Kensington Palace. The explanation had been gentle but clear: some people might want to hurt him not because he had done anything wrong, but because hurting him would hurt his family and the country. Diana had struggled with these restrictions more than anyone else in the family. She had wanted her children to have normal experiences, to connect with ordinary people without the barriers that royal protocol required. But she had also understood the dangers they faced, especially after receiving death threats that specifically mentioned plans to harm her children through poisoned food or contaminated gifts. The tragedy of Diana's death had intensified everyone's awareness of security threats, but it had also taught William that traditional security measures weren't always sufficient. His mother had died in circumstances that had nothing to do with food tampering or poison, but her death had reinforced the lesson that being royal meant living with constant danger from unexpected sources. Charles pulled out another document from the folder, this one marked with multiple security classifications. "There's been an increase in online discussions about targeting royal family members through food service," he explained. "Intelligence agencies are monitoring several forums where individuals are sharing detailed information about royal dining protocols, discussing potential vulnerabilities, and encouraging others to seek employment with royal food suppliers." This represented a new evolution in threats against the royal family. Previous generations had dealt with individual plotters or small groups working in isolation. The internet age had created opportunities for coordination between like-minded individuals across different countries, sharing information and techniques that made attacks more sophisticated and harder to detect. "The Glasgow Festival will need to be cancelled," William concluded after reviewing all the intelligence reports. "There are too many variables, too many potential points of failure in the security screening." Catherine nodded reluctantly. She knew that William took no pleasure in cancelling public appearances, especially events that were designed to support local businesses and communities. But she also understood that the risks had become unacceptable, and that no public relations benefit was worth endangering their family's safety. As Charles gathered the classified documents back into their folder, William reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since becoming a father. The food restrictions that had once seemed like minor inconveniences now felt like essential protections for his children. Every decision about what they ate, where they traveled, and who they interacted with carried implications that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The weight of this responsibility was something that William had never fully understood until he had children of his own. His father and grandmother had made these same calculations for decades, balancing the royal family's public duties against the very real threats they faced in private. Now it was William's turn to make those decisions, knowing that a single mistake could have consequences that went far beyond his own family. Louis had fallen asleep in Catherine's arms, unaware of the serious discussion that had been taking place around him. In a few years, he would begin learning the same lessons about caution and vigilance that had shaped his father's entire relationship with food and trust. He would understand that being royal meant accepting certain limitations and restrictions that other children didn't have to think about. But, for now, William was grateful that his youngest son could sleep peacefully, protected by security measures that he didn't know existed and protocols that kept him safe from threats he couldn't imagine. The food restrictions were just one part of a much larger framework designed to ensure that the royal family could continue their duties while staying alive in an increasingly dangerous world. The secure conference room beneath Buckingham Palace hummed with quiet tension as representatives from MI5, Scotland Yard, and the Royal Protection Unit gathered for an emergency briefing. William had been summoned to this meeting after intelligence agencies intercepted communications suggesting that his food safety protocols had been compromised by someone with inside knowledge of royal security procedures. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Morrison opened a laptop and projected surveillance footage onto the wall-mounted screens. The images showed kitchen staff at Kensington Palace going about their normal duties, but certain individuals had been highlighted with red markers indicating persons of interest. We've identified at least 3 staff members who have been asking unusual questions about Prince William's dietary restrictions and meal preparation schedules. William studied the faces on the screen carefully. These were people he saw regularly, staff members who had prepared thousands of meals for his family over the past several years. The idea that any of them might pose a threat was deeply unsettling, but it wasn't entirely surprising. Royal security experts had long warned that the greatest threats often came from trusted insiders who had access to information and opportunities that outsiders couldn't obtain. What kind of questions? William asked, though he suspected the answers would be more sophisticated than simple curiosity about royal preferences. Inspector Morrison clicked through several recorded conversations that had been captured by routine security monitoring. The first individual has been asking detailed questions about food storage protocols, specifically how long prepared meals are kept before serving and what testing procedures are used to verify safety. The second has been inquiring about backup meal preparation procedures and which staff members have access to ingredients before they're prepared. The third has been gathering information about Your Royal Highness's travel meal requirements and how food is transported for official engagements. Each question, taken individually, might have seemed like normal workplace curiosity. Taken together, they painted a picture of someone systematically mapping vulnerabilities in the royal family's food security systems. William had been briefed on these types of reconnaissance activities before, but experiencing them firsthand was a different matter entirely. The investigation had been triggered by intelligence from multiple sources suggesting that William's food restrictions had become a target for those seeking to harm the royal family. International terrorism experts had observed increased chatter in extremist communications about exploiting royal food protocols, while domestic surveillance had identified several individuals with concerning backgrounds who had attempted to gain employment with royal food suppliers. There's something else, Inspector Morrison continued, pulling up a new set of documents. We've discovered evidence that detailed information about royal meal preparation has been offered for sale on dark web marketplaces. Someone with intimate knowledge of palace operations has been providing blueprints of kitchen layouts, staff schedules, and security procedures to potential buyers. This revelation sent a chill through everyone in the room. Royal security had always operated under the assumption that certain information would eventually become public through disgruntled employees or security leaks. But the systematic sale of operational intelligence represented a new level of threat that required immediate countermeasures. William had experienced security breaches before, but nothing this comprehensive or potentially dangerous. During his military service, he had learned about operational security and the devastating impact that insider threats could have on even the most carefully planned missions. Now those same principles were being applied to something as basic as eating dinner with his family. How long has this been going on? William asked, reviewing the intelligence summaries that had been provided for the meeting. Based on communication intercepts and financial records, we believe the information sales began approximately 8 months ago, Inspector Morrison replied. The timing coincides with several new staff hires and the implementation of updated security protocols that were intended to strengthen food safety procedures. The irony wasn't lost on William that efforts to improve security had actually created new vulnerabilities by providing insiders with more detailed knowledge of royal protocols. This was a constant challenge in royal protection, balancing transparency with staff members who needed information to do their jobs against operational security requirements that demanded compartmentalized access to sensitive procedures. The meeting was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Edward Morrison, private secretary to the Queen, who carried additional classified materials that had been declassified specifically for this briefing. Her Majesty has authorized me to share historical context that may be relevant to current security concerns, he announced, settling into a chair at the conference table. Sir Edward opened a leather-bound folder containing documents that dated back several decades. In 1987, intelligence services discovered a similar insider threat operation targeting the royal family's food security protocols. A kitchen staff member at Balmoral had been systematically photographing meal preparation procedures and sharing information with individuals who were later identified as foreign intelligence operatives. William listened intently as Sir Edward described how that previous incident had been handled. The staff member had been quietly dismissed without criminal charges to avoid publicity that might have encouraged similar attempts by other potential threats. The security protocols had been completely redesigned, with new procedures that compartmentalized information and reduced the number of people who had access to comprehensive details about royal food safety measures. The operation was successful in identifying the immediate threat, Sir Edward continued, but intelligence reports suggested that the information gathered during those months of surveillance was retained by hostile entities and potentially used in subsequent planning against other members of the royal family. This historical context helped explain why William's food restrictions had become so comprehensive over the years. Each security incident had led to additional precautions, creating layers of protection that sometimes seemed excessive but were actually responses to real threats that had been discovered and neutralized before they could cause harm. The current investigation had been more successful than previous efforts because of improved surveillance technology and better coordination between different security agencies. But it had also revealed the sophisticated nature of modern threats against the royal family, including the use of social media and online marketplaces to coordinate activities and share intelligence. "We've identified the buyers for the information that was being sold," Inspector Morrison continued, projecting new surveillance images onto the screens. 3 individuals with chemical engineering backgrounds, 2 former military personnel with expertise in biological weapons, and at least 1 person with connections to international terrorism organizations. The profiles were sobering. These weren't amateur plotters or mentally unstable individuals making vague threats. They were trained professionals with specific skills and access to resources that could be used to create sophisticated assassination attempts that might not be detected until it was too late. William reviewed the intelligence summaries carefully, noting the level of detail that had been compiled about his personal habits and security protocols. Someone with inside access had provided information about everything from his preferred mealtimes to the specific brands of ingredients used in palace kitchens. This level of surveillance represented months of careful observation and systematic intelligence gathering. "What are the recommendations?" William asked, though he suspected that the answer would involve significant changes to his family's daily routines and increased restrictions on their already limited freedom. Inspector Morrison consulted her notes before responding. "Complete replacement of all kitchen staff who have had access to sensitive information within the past 12 months. Implementation of new compartmentalized procedures that limit individual access to comprehensive protocols. Enhanced background screening for all food service personnel, including psychological evaluations and regular polygraph testing. And temporary suspension of all public appearances involving food service until new security measures can be fully implemented." Each recommendation represented a major disruption to William's family life and royal duties. Replacing trusted staff members who had served the royal family for years would be emotionally difficult and practically challenging. The children had developed relationships with kitchen staff who prepared their meals, and explaining their sudden absence would require careful handling to avoid causing anxiety or confusion. The enhanced security measures would also make it much more difficult for William to maintain any semblance of normal family life. Meals would become even more regimented and controlled, with additional testing and verification procedures that would extend preparation times and limit flexibility in meal planning. "There's one more thing," Sir Edward added, consulting the historical documents he had brought to the meeting. "Her Majesty has decided to share information about Project Sustenance, a classified royal security program that was implemented after the 1987 incident." William had never heard of Project Sustenance, which wasn't surprising given the compartmentalized nature of royal security information. Even senior members of the royal family were only briefed on security programs that directly affected their personal protection requirements. Sir Edward explained that Project Sustenance was a comprehensive food security program that had been operating in secret for over 30 years. It included dedicated agricultural facilities that produced ingredients exclusively for royal consumption, complete genetic testing of all food products before preparation, and a network of trusted suppliers who underwent continuous monitoring and regular security updates. The program has prevented at least 12 confirmed poisoning attempts against various members of the royal family, Sir Edward revealed. Most of these incidents were never reported publicly to avoid encouraging copycat attempts and to protect the operational security of countermeasures that remain in effect. This information helped explain why William's food restrictions seemed so extensive compared to security measures visible to the public. What appeared to be excessive caution was actually a carefully designed system that had been proven effective through decades of actual threats and attempted attacks. The revelation also highlighted the personal cost of royal life that William's family paid in ways that the public never saw. Simple activities like sharing meals with friends or trying new restaurants required security planning that ordinary families couldn't imagine. Every bite of food had been analyzed, tested, and verified through procedures that treated meals like potential crime scenes. As the meeting concluded, William reflected on how these security requirements affected his children's development and understanding of their place in the world. George, Charlotte, and Louis were growing up with restrictions that they didn't fully comprehend, accepting limitations that seemed arbitrary but were actually essential for their survival. The challenge for William and Catherine was helping their children understand these restrictions without creating excessive anxiety or paranoia about the world around them. They wanted their children to be appropriately cautious without becoming fearful, to understand the unique risks they faced without losing their ability to connect with people and enjoy normal childhood experiences. The food security protocols were just one example of the hidden infrastructure that protected the royal family from threats that the public never learned about. Behind every public appearance, every family outing, and every simple meal was a complex web of security measures designed to ensure that the monarchy could continue its duties while keeping its members alive in an increasingly dangerous world. The private dining room at Sandringham felt unusually tense as 3 generations of the royal family gathered for what appeared to be a simple Sunday lunch. Queen Elizabeth II sat at the head of the table, her expressions serious as she reviewed a classified briefing document that had arrived that morning. Prince Charles sat to her right, while William and Catherine occupied chairs across from each other. With the children notably absent, they had been sent to play in another room under the supervision of trusted nannies. This wasn't a social meal. This was a crisis management session disguised as family time, called after intelligence services had uncovered evidence of the most sophisticated threat against the royal family's food security that had ever been identified. The threat was so serious that it required immediate decisions about fundamental changes to how the monarchy would operate for the foreseeable future. The intelligence is conclusive, the Queen began, her voice carrying the weight of 8 decades of experience with royal security challenges. Someone has successfully infiltrated our food supply chain at multiple levels, with access that extends far beyond what we initially suspected. This isn't just about individual staff members asking suspicious questions. This is a coordinated operation that has been years in the planning. William had suspected that the morning's urgent summons to Sandringham meant serious news, but the gravity in his grandmother's voice suggested something far worse than typical security concerns. Throughout his life, he had witnessed the Queen handle various crises with calm determination, but this was different. This was personal. Charles pulled out a tablet displaying surveillance footage and intelligence reports that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated infiltration attempts. MI5 has identified at least 7 individuals with documented connections to hostile entities who have gained employment with various suppliers in our food chain over the past 3 years. 3 more have been discovered working for catering companies that provide services during official royal engagements. The scope of the infiltration was staggering. These weren't random attempts by individual bad actors, but a systematic effort to place operatives in positions where they could gather intelligence, monitor royal food protocols, and potentially execute attacks at multiple points in the supply chain. Catherine listened with growing concern as the details were revealed. As someone who had joined the royal family as an adult, she had learned about food security protocols through training rather than growing up with them as natural parts of life. But she had also brought an outsider's perspective that sometimes identified vulnerabilities that longtime royal family members had learned to accept as normal. The children's school meals, she said suddenly, realizing implications that hadn't been explicitly stated. If they have this level of access to our supply chains, what about the protocols for George and Charlotte at school? The question hung in the air for several moments before Charles answered. All 3 children will need to be withdrawn from their current schools immediately and placed in secure educational environments with completely controlled meal preparation. There's no way to guarantee their safety in traditional school settings until this threat is neutralized. For William and Catherine, this represented the complete disruption of their carefully planned approach to giving their children as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of royal life. They had fought to keep George and Charlotte in regular schools where they could interact with other children and experience something approaching ordinary educational environments. Now even that limited normalcy was being stripped away by security requirements that would isolate their children further from the world they would someday be expected to lead. The Queen continued reviewing the intelligence reports, occasionally making notes in margins with handwriting that remained remarkably steady despite her advanced age. There's historical precedent for this type of coordinated threat, she observed, referencing experiences from earlier in her reign that had never been made public. In 1973, we discovered a similar operation that had been in development for over 5 years, she explained. Foreign intelligence operatives had systematically infiltrated multiple levels of our food supply chain, gathering detailed information about our protocols and looking for opportunities to execute what they called plausibly deniable elimination operations. William had heard fragments of this story before, but never the complete details. The 1973 incident had resulted in a complete overhaul of royal food security that had established many of the protocols he had grown up following. Now it appeared that those same protocols were being tested by an even more sophisticated threat. How was the 1973 situation resolved? Catherine asked, though she suspected the answer might involve measures that would be difficult to implement in the current era of social media and instant global communication. The Queen's expression grew even more serious. 3 members of the royal family spent 8 months living under what was essentially house arrest while intelligence services dismantled the operation piece by piece. All public appearances were cancelled, all travel was suspended, and all meals were prepared by military personnel in secure facilities. It was effective, but the cost to our ability to fulfill royal duties was enormous. The possibility of implementing similar measures in 2023 presented challenges that hadn't existed in 1973. The royal family's public profile and ceremonial duties had expanded significantly, with public expectations for accessibility and transparency that made extended isolation much more difficult to justify or maintain. Social media and 24-hour news coverage meant that any significant changes to royal routines would immediately become public knowledge, potentially compromising the security measures that made such changes necessary. The royal family was trapped between the need for enhanced protection and the public requirements of their constitutional role. William reviewed additional intelligence documents that detailed the sophistication of current threats. The infiltration operation included individuals with advanced training in chemistry, biology, and toxicology who had been specifically recruited for their technical expertise and their ability to blend into ordinary workplace environments. They've been testing our detection capabilities, Charles observed, pointing to a section of the report that described several incidents where suspicious substances had been introduced into food preparation areas in quantities too small to cause harm but sufficient to test response protocols. These test runs had provided the hostile operatives with detailed information about how quickly suspicious activities were detected, which security measures were most effective, and where vulnerabilities existed in the royal family's food safety systems. The psychological impact of learning about these tests was perhaps worse than discovering direct attack attempts. William realized that for months, possibly years, his family had been unknowingly participating in reconnaissance activities designed to gather intelligence for future assassination attempts. Every meal had potentially been a data-gathering opportunity for people who wanted to kill them. Every bite of food had been a chance for hostile operatives to refine their understanding of royal security protocols and identify weaknesses that could be exploited in actual attacks. What are our options? William asked, though he suspected that all available choices involved significant sacrifices in terms of personal freedom and public duties. The Queen consulted notes that had been prepared by senior security advisors before the meeting. Option 1 is immediate implementation of military-level food security protocols, with all meal preparation handled by vetted military personnel in secure facilities. This would provide maximum protection but would require suspension of most public engagements for an indefinite period. The second option involved relocating the entire immediate royal family to secure facilities while intelligence services worked to dismantle the infiltration network. This would provide excellent security but would essentially remove the royal family from public view for months or possibly years. The third option was more complex but potentially more sustainable long-term. It involved creating completely new identity and location protocols for the royal family's food service operations, establishing new supply chains with enhanced security measures, and implementing advanced detection technologies that could identify threats before they reached meal preparation stages. Catherine asked the question that everyone was thinking but nobody had voiced. What happens if we don't implement any of these options? What happens if we try to continue with current protocols? The answer came from a security assessment that had been prepared specifically to address that possibility. Intelligence analysts had concluded that continuing current operations would result in a successful attack against a member of the royal family within 6 months, with a probability rating that was high enough to be considered virtually certain. They'd had too much time to study our procedures, Charles explained. They understand our security measures better than many of our own staff members do.
Continuing current protocols would be equivalent to providing them with a detailed timeline for when and how they plan to execute their attack. The weight of this assessment settled over the room like a heavy blanket.
William looked at Catherine and saw his own fears reflected in her expression. They had always known that royal life involved security risks, but they had never imagined that something as basic as eating dinner with their children could become a potential death sentence. The children were growing up with food restrictions that they accepted as normal parts of their lives, not understanding that these restrictions were actually life or death security measures. Now even those extensive precautions were insufficient to protect them from threats that had evolved beyond what previous generations of royal security experts had anticipated. "There's one more factor to consider," the Queen added, consulting a final classified document. "Intelligence suggests that this operation is being funded and coordinated by state actors who view disrupting the British monarchy as part of larger geopolitical objectives.
This isn't just about harming individual members of our family.
This is about undermining the constitutional stability of the United Kingdom." This revelation placed the food security threats in a much broader context of international relations and national security. The royal family's personal safety had become intertwined with questions about British sovereignty and the country's ability to protect its most important constitutional institutions from foreign interference. William realized that the decisions they made in the coming days would affect not just his family's safety and privacy, but the monarchy's ability to fulfill its constitutional role and maintain public confidence in British institutions. The food restrictions that had shaped his entire adult life were about to become even more comprehensive and intrusive, with implications that would extend far beyond meal planning and family dinners. The Sunday lunch that had brought 3 generations together to discuss these threats would likely be one of the last normal family meals they would share for a very long time. 6 months after the emergency meeting at Sandringham, William sat in a completely transformed dining room at a location that officially didn't exist on any royal property records. The secure facility, known only by its military designation Facility Phoenix, had been constructed in unprecedented secrecy to serve as the royal family's primary residence while the food security crisis was being resolved. Everything about their new reality would have seemed impossible to imagine just a year earlier. Meals were prepared by military personnel who had undergone months of specialized training and continuous psychological evaluation. Every ingredient was tracked from source to plate through a chain of custody that included genetic testing, chemical analysis, and radiation screening. Even water was imported from secure sources and tested multiple times before being approved for consumption. The children had adapted to these changes with the resilience that had always amazed William. George, now 9 years old, had accepted the explanation that they were living in a special place while their regular homes were being renovated. Charlotte had embraced the adventure aspect of their temporary relocation, treating the security measures like an elaborate game. Louis, still too young to understand the implications, simply enjoyed the attention from the additional staff members who ensured his safety. But the psychological toll on the adults had been significant. Catherine struggled with the isolation from friends and family members who couldn't be granted security clearances for the facility. William found himself constantly analyzing every meal for signs of tampering, even though he knew the security measures made such concerns largely unnecessary. The investigation into the infiltration network had revealed a conspiracy that exceeded even the most pessimistic intelligence estimates. Over 40 individuals with connections to hostile foreign intelligence services had been identified within the royal family's extended food supply chain. The operation had been in development for over 7 years, with systematic recruitment of operatives who had been placed in positions throughout the entire system that fed the royal family. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison visited the facility regularly to brief William on the investigation's progress. The scope of the conspiracy had required coordination between multiple intelligence agencies and had resulted in arrests across 3 countries. But the most disturbing discovery had been evidence that the operation was just one component of a larger campaign designed to destabilize the British government through targeted attacks on key constitutional figures. "The good news is that we've dismantled the immediate threat," Inspector Morrison reported during her latest briefing. "Every identified operative has been arrested or neutralized, and we've implemented completely new supply chain protocols that should prevent similar infiltrations in the future." William appreciated the progress, but he also understood that the security measures implemented to protect his family had fundamentally changed their relationship with the outside world. The isolation required to ensure their safety had created its own set of challenges that would have long-term consequences for the monarchy's public role. The most difficult aspect had been explaining to the children why they couldn't see their friends, attend their old schools, or participate in activities that they had previously enjoyed. child psychologists had been consulted to help develop age-appropriate explanations that wouldn't create lasting anxiety or trauma, but William worried about the long-term impact of growing up under such restrictive security conditions.
When can we go home?
Charlotte asked during one of their evening meals, the question that all of them had been thinking but avoiding discussing directly. Catherine had prepared for this question with input from security experts and child development specialists, but it was still one of the most difficult conversations she had ever had to navigate as a parent. "We need to stay here until some very smart people finish making our regular homes even safer than they were before," she explained carefully. The explanation was truthful without being terrifying, but it didn't address the underlying reality that their regular homes might never again provide the level of security that their family now required. The threats had evolved to a point where traditional royal residences, despite their extensive security measures, couldn't provide adequate protection against the sophisticated attacks that intelligence agencies had discovered. William had spent considerable time reviewing plans for long-term security arrangements that would allow his family to resume some version of normal life while maintaining the protection they needed. The solutions were complex and expensive, requiring construction of new facilities and implementation of security technologies that had never been used for civilian protection. The financial cost of the enhanced security measures had required special appropriations from Parliament, though the public had been told only that the funds were for infrastructure improvements at royal properties. The true cost included not just the physical security upgrades, but the ongoing operational expenses for personnel, testing, and monitoring that would continue indefinitely.
More challenging than the financial implications were the constitutional questions raised by the security requirements.
The royal family's ability to fulfill their public duties had been severely restricted by the need to maintain secure environments and controlled food sources. State dinners had been cancelled, public appearances had been limited, and traditional ceremonial functions had been modified to accommodate security protocols. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had visited the facility several times to discuss how the security situation affected the government's ability to use royal family members for diplomatic purposes and public engagements. The monarchy's soft power effectiveness depended partly on accessibility and public visibility that had become much more difficult to maintain. "The security requirements have created a new model for how the monarchy operates," Sunak had explained during his most recent visit.
"We're essentially pioneering approaches that may become necessary for other constitutional monarchies facing similar threats."
Intelligence reports suggested that the food security infiltration operation against the British royal family had been a test case for similar attacks planned against other European monarchies. The techniques and methodologies that had been discovered in Britain were being adapted for use against royal families in Belgium, Sweden, and the Netherlands. This international dimension meant that the security solutions developed for William's family had implications that extended far beyond their personal safety. The protocols and technologies being implemented were being shared with allied intelligence services and would likely influence how democratic governments protected their key constitutional figures for decades to come. William had participated in several secure video conferences with security officials from other countries, sharing lessons learned from the British experience and coordinating countermeasures against what appeared to be a broader campaign of attacks against European institutions. The psychological impact of living under such intensive security had required ongoing support from mental health professionals who had been specially cleared to work with the royal family. The stress of constant vigilance, combined with the isolation from normal social interactions, had created challenges that previous generations of royals had never had to face. "The children are resilient, but they're also developing coping mechanisms that may not be healthy long-term," Dr. Amanda Foster, the family's psychological counselor, had warned during a recent session. Living under constant security restrictions is creating patterns of thinking and behavior that could affect their ability to form normal relationships and trust other people. This was perhaps William's greatest fear, that the security measures necessary to keep his children alive might also prevent them from developing the emotional and social skills they would need to be effective monarchs in the future. The delicate balance between protection and preparation for their future roles was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Catherine had begun working with education specialists to develop learning programs that could provide the children with appropriate academic and social development while maintaining the security requirements of their current situation. The solutions involved virtual reality systems that allowed them to interact with other children in simulated environments, along with carefully controlled visits from pre-screened playmates who could be brought to the secure facility. The technology required to maintain these interactions securely was expensive and complex, but it represented an attempt to provide the children with some approximation of normal childhood experiences. William wasn't entirely convinced that virtual interactions could substitute for real friendships, but he appreciated the effort to find creative solutions to unprecedented challenges. As the months passed, William had come to understand that the food security crisis had fundamentally changed not just his family's daily routines, but their entire relationship with their royal duties and public roles. The monarchy was evolving in response to security threats that previous generations had never imagined, creating new precedents that would influence how future kings and queens balanced personal safety with constitutional responsibilities. The experience had also taught him valuable lessons about the hidden costs of royal life that the public rarely saw or understood. Behind every public appearance, every state dinner, and every family photograph were security professionals working to ensure that something as simple as eating lunch wouldn't result in assassination. The food restrictions that had shaped William's adult life were now extending to his children, but with a level of intensity and sophistication that reflected the evolution of threats against the royal family. What had once seemed like excessive caution had proven to be essential preparation for dangers that were very real and potentially deadly. Looking toward the future, William understood that his children would grow up with security requirements that would make his own restricted childhood seem remarkably free by comparison. They would inherit a monarchy that had been fundamentally shaped by the need to survive in a world where even the most basic human activities carried potentially fatal risks. The greatest challenge would be ensuring that these security necessities didn't prevent the royal family from fulfilling their constitutional role and maintaining the public connection that made the monarchy relevant and effective. The balance between protection and public service would define how the crown evolved in the 21st century, with implications that extended far beyond any individual member of the royal family. The food restrictions that had started as simple safety precautions had become symbols of much larger questions about how democratic institutions could protect themselves while remaining accessible and effective. William's personal struggle with these restrictions had become part of a broader transformation of the monarchy that would influence British constitutional arrangements for generations to come.